Hi guys, welcome to the video. So this video is about a certain topic that's really important for me, which is MGTOW. Um, I've been MGTOW for 20 years, my entire adult life. I'm 40 now, and I'd say I went MGTOW at 20. So I feel like I should say something since I see a lot of really negative comments on the internet about MGTOW. A lot of hate toward the MGTOW community. It kind of, if you do a search for MGTOW on the Google, you'll see a lot of search engine results that are extremely negative about people who are MGTOW, describing like extremism and things like that. So I thought I'd like to talk about the long-term lifestyle, what it's like when you get to 40. 2 decades of being a MGTOW is quite a long time, and so I think I might be one of the first MGTOW ever, really. I've almost never broken the basic tenets of the philosophy of life. I've almost never cohabited in 20 years. I did it once in China, and for around 9 months. I had to help this girl because she was kind of poor and she couldn't afford to stay in her own accommodation. So I just helped her out, and so she stayed with me for 9 months. That's the only period in the last 20 years where I've cohabited with a woman who wasn't my blood relation. I never got married in those 20 years, and I never had any children. So I just like to talk about what it was like, what I did, the pros and the cons, and looking at the next 20 years too. So the younger guys watching this video might avoid the mistakes I made. And let's just talk about it then, I guess. So I went MGTOW at 20. And back then, things were really different. There was a limited amount of information concerning what married life is actually like. Very little objective information. Census. What people take for granted now, information-wise, just was not there at all. For example, the census, for example, was not online. You couldn't search. You couldn't really know what was the probability of marital breakdown. You couldn't know what's the probability of being divorced, losing your house, alimony, child support. Those statistics weren't there because the data wasn't on the internet at that point. As a young man, you had very limited sources of information. You literally had to ask an older guy, what's it like to be married? And I did do that. I asked a older guy, what's it like to be married? And should I do it? Should I go down that traditional route of life? And he told me that he worked in a factory. He's a factory worker. And he told me that he made a minimum wage, pretty much. And he was like 40. He had 3 kids to support and his wife. And he said on the Friday, he'd get enough money from his wife to buy 4, maybe 5 pints in the local pub. And then he'd go to the pub and he'd get drunk, and then he'd come home. And that was his personal spending money for the week. There was nothing else. He got a packed lunch for work, and he everything else was purchased for him by his wife. Clothing, and obviously she cooked him a meal every day for dinner. And that was it. That was his life. And he described this to me, and he said that's what married life is like for me. And obviously, I thought about his answer. Obviously, he had some benefits to his life, like it was honorable. He had good standing in society. But I didn't think it was for me. I think it was a pretty difficult deal to accept in life, because you're talking about 40 years of working in a factory like that. So I was looking for a different way to live. And I thought the married route was pretty bad. The benefits were limited. It was crushing responsibilities. And then in Ireland, where I grew up, they passed divorce legislation and stuff like that. And I knew that at that point that things were going to get increasingly difficult for married people, for married men. So I did look for further information back then, and I looked in the beginning of the internet. There were, back in the day, older guys discussing what married life is like online on these kind of like men's health websites. And they had like threads that went on for years. And one question, this thread was entitled like my wife, how often does your wife give you sex? That was the title. And this thread, I believe it was a men's health website. It went on for years of these men online, older guys talking about it. And they said things that are amazing, like they'd have a calendar, they used to have, some guys had calendars, they used to like keep a calendar of how frequently they had sex to see if things were getting better. And it usually wasn't. And those older guys really did suffer in silence because they had no one to talk to in the society. It was kind of like a taboo topic. Now, they just described a world where you get married and the rate of sex with your wife dramatically drops. And so the sexual aspect of the relationship dies off pretty quickly. And once she has a child, it's pretty much over. Your sex life as a married guy decreases substantially. And you're essentially just, your role then is just to provide an income for the woman and her kids. They did suffer a lot, but I did read the whole thread, and then I realized, this is a pretty tough deal. Essentially the way the basic society was working 20 years ago was the woman would give you sex to get you addicted to sex, and then get you to marry her, and then they'd have kids, and that was it. But it was just a lure, they'd use sex to lure you into kind of a productive job, get work, and then like immediately when you get married or something gets serious, immediately you must go to the bank and take out the biggest mortgage that you can afford to buy the biggest house possible. That was the basic model of relationships back then. Anyway, I read that online, and it really did open my eyes. And at that point, that confirmed what the older guy had said to me in confidence. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to go MGTOW. I'm never going to get married. It's not a good deal for men. It might be for some guys, but I'm not doing it. It's pretty bad. There's a lot of responsibilities, a lot, and the benefits are fleeting. And with the divorce legislation that came in, there's also the risk of losing your house and losing your family. So the risks increase over time too. So what did I do as a MGTOW for 20 years? what was it like? Well, I had my first dream in my life was I wanted to see the entire world. And over the last 20 years, I have achieved that dream. I saw over 20, maybe 51, 52 countries. I visited every major religious group and philosophical area of the planet. The first area that I traveled was Southeast Asia. Um, that was really eye-opening and a lot of fun. I saw Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. It was a really interesting place and a lot of fun. And back 20 years ago, everything was quite optimistic in that region. And I spent around a year there. And it was really eye-opening, kind of like hedonic, but in a rudimentary way. People just like to go to the beach, they take drugs or drink a lot. But generally it was an optimistic time. After that area, I did some work in Ireland and saved up some money. And I then took a good trip to Southeast Asia. No, South Asia. So India and the Pakistan areas in the north too. So I traveled all around India for around a year. It was difficult, very hard. The culture shock was massive. I didn't really enjoy myself too much. Intellectually, it was really fascinating. You know, you saw a completely different philosophy of life. People interpreted the world differently there. They saw it as kind of an illusion. The world is an illusion. Possibly the best part was in the south, the deep south. Like Kerala was quite advanced. But it really opened my eyes to the amount of poverty and intellectual demoralization that's possible in societies. And I was pretty happy when I left India, but you know, intellectually it had the biggest impact because you saw an incredibly different philosophy of life operating in the society. And so that was kind of opened a third eye for me. I was never the same after India because I realized that a lot of the concepts you're brought up with, really they're not like fixed. They're not absolute truth. There are different parts of the planet that believe completely different things. Their belief system is completely different and they operate completely differently. So intellectually, it was the most enlightening place I've ever traveled to. It changed me the most. With respect to pleasure, there was none. Very limited pleasure in India. So you don't go there for fun at all. After that, I went back to work for a while. I did some work, made some more money. And I started studying economy around about that time. So this is maybe 5 years into being a MGTOW. I started studying the economy and I realized there was some really big difficulties coming up. And this was around the year 2005. I knew there was some big problems brewing in the financial system from my studies. I studied Marx and studied a few different high-level economy guys. And I took out huge amounts of debt from the bank because I knew there was a big crisis coming. I was working, but I took out huge amounts of debt, and then I just left and flew to Spain. In Barcelona, I lived there for a month or two. It was a lot of fun. It was a very, very cool place back then. And then I flew to South America, and I lived there for a few years without working. I just used my debt that I'd taken out to finance an extremely hedonic lifestyle. I saw Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, and I lived the longest period of time in Bolivia. That place was really exciting. There was a lot of fun there. I used to hang out with people who were kind of making TV programs. I lived downtown. I was in the wealthiest part of the city, so I used to hang out with the elites there. And they certainly knew how to party. It was also different also with respect to drugs. They would take cocaine like it was like a coffee. They kind of saw it as kind of like a stimulant just to keep you awake. So I lived there for a year or two, and it was an incredibly good time. I had a lot of fun. And when I was there, I just spent my time studying all the time. I had like loads of books on philosophy, theology, and all these subjects. And I would just party every night with my friends. And in the morning time, I just study for a few hours every day until I ran out of all my money. I was down to like $1 or something like that, and I asked my family to fly me home, and they just flew me home. And I'd been away for a few years, and when I landed, the great financial crisis started, and all of my debts were wiped out because the banks almost went under. And so I timed taking out the debt perfectly just before the crash. I got to spend all the money, and then when it happened, the banks almost became insolvent, and the debt, they couldn't really go after me for it because the society and the financial systems had been wrecked. So I timed that really well, and I had had a free holiday for several years. At that point, I wasn't sure what to do, but once again, my dream was to see the entire planet. So I thought, now's the chance for me to go to the Muslim world. I'll see the Muslim world this time. South America had been extremely hedonic, so I thought, okay, let's take a break from that. And I traveled to Saudi Arabia. I got a job in Saudi, in Mecca, in the Mecca province. When you meet people who've been to Saudi Arabia, you always have a bond, because if you've never been there, it's impossible for me to describe what it's like to live there. It just isn't possible. I can't describe it using words. My time there was incredibly difficult. It was hard. A lot of danger. My job was essentially to coax Bedouin into an educational facility so that they wouldn't join Al-Qaeda. You'd have to pay them money. The facility was built in the desert, and I was there, and there was a lot of extremists, and increasingly, like, even people I was working with were extremists, because not many Western people would work there. It was a dangerous area, and so even like Westerners that I was working with were most of the time, they were radicals. They were religious radicals. It was difficult to get like a secular European or American to work there because it was just so hostile. My time there was almost all pain, but intellectually interesting. You got to see the pure form of Islam, how it really works as a society, living amongst them. So intellectually, it was interesting. Was there any pleasure? Not really. There were periods. I was invited to a palace once, and then I got to have parties in palaces a few times, and then I met like the elites, and so they were taking drugs and drinking, and so there was some sort of pleasure sometimes on the weekend, but I think it was quite minor. And when I look back at it, it was kind of like there was a desperate search for pleasure in that society. That was, most of the time, it was a waste of my life, our money, our effort. There's no pleasure in Saudi. After Saudi Arabia, I moved to Kuwait. I worked there too. I got a job there and I was checking that out. And once again, everything went really bad in Kuwait. It kind of like collapsed as a society. My life collapsed there. There was really a lot of like really crazy people in the Middle East. Just generally attracts crazy people. And so wherever you go, you're going to be surrounded, you're going to be in contact with some pretty extreme personality types. Kuwait, I survived like an assassination attempt in my life there. Some guy who used to be my friend, like he was a Westerner, and I used to tell him about what work I did in Saudi Arabia. And then which was fine, he was cool with it. But then he converted to radical Islam. And then he told his new friends the type of work that I did in Saudi. And they didn't like what they heard. So they organized an assassination attempt, a kidnapping attempt on me. Yeah. But I was quite physically strong, and I was able to survive the attack and escape. But it left a pretty bad impression of Kuwait for me. That was a bad ending to my trip there. And got a bad beating, but I still survived. After that, I fled to Turkey, and I had a beautiful girlfriend from Morocco there. And that lasted for 1 month, and it was probably one of the nicest periods of my life. Just having a good-looking girlfriend and just traveling around downtown Istanbul. That's a really cool city back in the day. Not so much anymore, but it was really cool. Maybe 12 years ago. After that, another one of my friends offered me a job in Libya, and I worked there for around a year. And I lived in the desert, and in the Sahara Desert. It was very beautiful. So one of the great pleasures of my life was to live in that place, because I got to see one of the most extraordinary places on the planet. There were no girls in Libya. There was no fun. But in that camp where I was working, there was an oil field. It had a beautiful pool in the middle of the camp. It was a beautiful swimming pool. So in the evening, every day I'd just swim, and then I'd walk into the desert in the evening time and look at the stars. It was a very peaceful place until it got attacked by NATO when I was there. And it all went really, really upside down. Warfare broke out, and I had to fly to Tripoli. And when I got to Tripoli, there was some heavy gunfighting, heavy clashes. They were using anti-aircraft guns inside the city against civilians. And those bullets are pretty big, and they go through the walls of houses. So I broke into a fever because I got so stressed out from this, there was heavy clashes and gunfire, and these guns were pretty big. So I had a fever. And then I tried to get out of the city. I went to the airport. There was pandemonium. It was crazy. It was really crazy, Tens of thousands of people trying to get out of the country at the exact same time. Gunfire in the distance. People were doing anything to get out. They'd spend any amount of money. There were guys who bought 10 flights, but all the flights were canceled because it was dangerous to fly in. So eventually, I was there for a day, and I was getting a bit worried. It was a very limited food supply in the airport too. And then I was approached by a person. They said, "Look, there's a pilot who's robbing a plane, and if you give him $500, he'll let you on." And I said, "Where's the plane flying? Because we don't know, but you want to get on the plane? And I said, yeah, okay. And I just grabbed my cash. And then I was shuffled through security and I onto the tarmac, and I kind of ran to the airplane. It was like a Boeing jet, not too big. But I got on it, and there was only like 20 people who got on the plane, because it wasn't too much time to get ready, because the plane was being robbed. So the pilot just got on, closed the door, and he just took off in the middle of the night. And there was no destination. He just flew into the sky and started flying toward, like, deeper into Africa. And he said he's going to try and land in or someplace like that, some crazy place. It turns out that we were flying over a country called Mali, and they said they'd let him land, and he landed. The pilot landed, and I became a refugee. I had to pay for a refugee visa on my arrival, so I became a refugee in Mali. I had to actually pay money to be a refugee. They gave me a 5-day refugee visa. And once again, I was in a lot of shock, and I'd lost a lot of my pay that I was owed in Libya was discontinued. And I flew from Libya to Switzerland. My family flew me out of there, and I went skiing, and I promised myself when I was skiing that I would never go to a Muslim country again. That part of my life was over, and I'll never do it again. So after that, I then flew to Japan, and I spent several years first in Japan, then in Korea, South Korea, and then I eventually moved to China, and I spent several years in China as a teacher. And that period of my life, I think, was the most positive ever. I had multiple girlfriends. It was a lot of fun. There was no drugs or anything like that. In that part of the world, they don't really take drugs. It was just like beer, wine. You'd have a girlfriend all the time. And I spent maybe 5 years there. And I think China was the best. It was the most fun. Chinese people are very pro-business, pro-work. They like working and producing stuff. So I thought the atmosphere there was really exciting. After that, then when I was in China, maybe on my 3rd year, I started writing, and I wrote the Philosophy of Capitalism trilogy, and that was my second dream. Something I always wanted to do was to kind of like write some output that would be exciting or interesting. So I did that, and my life kind of changed then because my social group changed. And I ended up having to do some serious research concerning like system level issues, World War, and also about the reset. And I wrote the reset, the concluding volume. So intellectually, my life completely changed at that, because of that process. It took around 3 years of work, and I finished that work when I was around 35. And we're now living in the reset. So we're around 2 years into it. And it's quite an extraordinary event so far. There's been a lot of action around the planet, lockdowns, and other issues that have been implemented. So that was, being a MGTOW allowed me to do intellectual work that most people would not be allowed or capable of doing. When you have no wife or kids, you don't really need that much money, and you don't really need people or society to support you too much. So you can do things that married men can't. You can do work that most people wouldn't do. And because you don't have a wife or kids, you don't need society too much. So you can do work that other guys would never do. If somebody doesn't like the work I do, I don't care. What can they do against me? They can do nothing. And I don't need society too much. my needs are very low. As a MGTOW, my needs are very, very low. I don't need much. I don't need so much support. So being a MGTOW allowed me to do some advanced research and really deep thinking that might not be too popular, but it was very influential. You can never do that type of research concerning, say, like capitalism requires world war or these issues. You could never do it like as a professor in a university, as a married guy. These are controversial topics, very controversial. The reset, it's a very controversial issue. It has destroyed countless lives already. It has. But as a MGTOW, I could do that research and I could publish it. I didn't care. I don't need anybody's permission. No one can criticize me. If someone doesn't like what I write, I don't care, because I don't need it. So as a MGTOW, it's a very liberating philosophy of life. You can do a lot in your life because you don't need society too much. You'll find that you'll always have savings. You'll always be in a liquid position. You don't have to go into debt if you don't want to. I found that I often live in hotels, like later on in life, after the age of 35. I just started living in hotels or long-term apartment hotels. So you'd kind of have like servants cleaning your apartment, people taking care of you, you know, you live in a secure building. You could travel whenever you want. If you don't want to work, you don't have to work. You have a lot of liquid savings. You don't have to work if you don't want to. So with this reset, I didn't work, you know, so far 2 years. If I don't want to work, I don't have to work. I can just sit at home or sit in an apartment and wait it out. With respect to cooking and things like that, usually I just go to like restaurants every day and I just eat out every day. I don't bother with cooking or anything like that. I just go out all the time in the evening time. So my material standard of living is very high just on the daily basis, irrespective of where I'm living. So the benefits of being that kind of MGTOW guy is that you just have liquid wealth and you have no debt. And that's a very liberating position to be in. You don't need to work every day. You can take time off. You can take multiple years off if you want to. Okay? If you don't find a job that's interesting, you just don't work. So there's a huge benefit in that regard. So as you get older, as an older MGTOW, you'll find you'll just have more liquid cash, liquid wealth. That's because you're just a single guy. Did I make any mistakes? I would say that like I did kind of make some mistakes. I think I could have worked online. I have a degree in computer applications. So maybe I should have just worked online and then traveled while working online as a computer programmer. But the reason why I often did teaching is because it allowed me to kind of become part of this society. One of the problems with a MGTOW is that you might become lonely, especially if you're traveling a lot. And if you're programming online, it's even more lonely, okay? But maybe it's better if you always just get a job. I found that to be true. If you're traveling as a MGTOW, you should just work. You shouldn't travel for the purpose of traveling. You should get a job. And so you will have friends, you'll have a social identity within this society, you'll be productive, other people will know what you're doing there. I think that's a way better life. And if you're working online, you won't make friends. when I worked in China, I worked for the Ministry of Education for China. I was a state employee for 3 years. And you might think, it wasn't such a good job, but it was really interesting because you got to see the government culture. I deconstructed their culture, their language. I got to see how they work, the psychology of their work, the psychology of their government. How does it work in day-to-day life? It's a completely different experience if you're just a tourist in that country. You really do know why the culture is the way it is, because you work with the culture every day. You're a worker with them. Okay, so I would always advise MGTOW to work, even if you've got money. It doesn't matter. Get a job. So in hindsight, looking back over the last 20 years, it's been a pretty good journey. I've had a lot of fun. Had a lot of girlfriends. Seen most of the planet. Once again, maybe 52 countries. I lived 2 dreams. I got to see the world, and also I got to write a book trilogy that was quite influential. And that was my second dream, and that's good. And now I'm 40, and everything's gone great. In those 40 years, it's been great. It's been quite nice. I would say, though, that I'd have to give a bit of a warning to other MGTOW. Young guys, listen to this. There is some downsides to being MGTOW. One is that since you live a life that's completely different to 99% of the population, you have to be kind of careful about what you say in public. People might not trust a single guy traveling around the planet like some sort of... Trust might be a bit low. So you should be very careful about what you say in public or in the workplace. For me, you should be very conservative about your statements. You should say nothing that might be construed as extreme. Just anything. You should say nothing really that could be political. Already you're not really a trusted personality. You're not married, you don't have kids. Your lifestyle is not easy to interpret. So you should avoid any political statements whatsoever. You should say nothing political and just do your job. There is another downside to being MGTOW, and I think that it's never really stated online. I think there's an increased risk of death. As a MGTOW over the last 20 years, I think I have come close to dying several times. When I was in India, I was mountain climbing in Kashmir. I almost died. It took a long time to recover from that injury. I had to be flown home. In Kuwait, there was an assassination attempt. I got a bad beating. Could have died if I hadn't gotten away. Libya, I was in a war zone, in battles, surrounded by battles. You could die or even be captured. It's even worse, you might be captured and made into some sort of slave. When I was in Cambodia, I was driving home one evening, and I was in a motorbike taxi, and the driver was on drugs and decided to play chicken with another driver, and they had a head-on collision because they were both on drugs. And this is in the middle of the night, and I could have almost died doing that too. That was a head-on motorbike accident, and I walked away from it, unscathed, but it could have ended up me being dead. And that's just like the MGTOW life. Because you're single, because you don't have a wife or kids, you're going to end up in situations that a normal person who's married with kids would never do. Married guy would never be in a casino in the middle of the night in Cambodia and then paying some drug addict to drive him back to his hotel at 3 o'clock in the morning. Married men with kids do not do stuff like that. Okay, so I think there's a definite increased risk of death, premature death, and it shouldn't be overlooked. It can happen, but so far the last 20 years have been very enlightening, very positive, and incredibly liberating. I haven't had to work too much, and it's been an incredible amount of pleasure. I got to see a large part of the planet and have a lot of fun with a lot of really cool people. Okay, so I'd like to say goodbye, and I hope you all have a nice day. And for my MGTOW brothers, good luck.